Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of The Next Page, our podcast, Library and Archives Geneva. We have a bookcast today, and I have in the studio the author, Adam Day. He wrote his latest book just this year. It's called The Forever Crisis. So the book that we explore today is basically an introduction to complex systems thinking at the global governance level. So there are concepts in there and tools and ways of thinking that are useful when we approach system change that can be applied to the most pressing problems facing the world today. So it's very timely. So Adam, welcome again to the podcast. You've been here before, and for those listening, we put out excellent episodes on the high-level board on multilateralism report that you describe in 2 episodes that I find formidable to understand really the intricacies of all that, going into the Pact of the Future. So you're a usual guest of our podcast, and thank you for taking time for being with us today to present your latest book. Now, for those who haven't listened to those episodes or are not familiar with who you are and the work you do, just before we dive in, introduce a little bit yourself and give the audience also some context on how you got to writing this book, The Forever Crisis.
Thanks, Francesco. It's great to be back. Yeah, my name's Adam Day, and I head UN University's Center for Policy Research office here in Geneva. And I can actually pinpoint the exact day I started thinking about this. I was previously the senior political advisor to the UN peace operation in Congo, and I was developing strategies for dealing with armed groups and talking to a friend of mine. And I was complaining, actually, that change didn't happen the way we expected it to in a place like Congo. We kept thinking that if we could build a police station and extend a road and build a courthouse, peace would kind of follow from that type of linear thinking, if you can fix this kind of governance problem. And he encouraged me to read a very short article by Rachel Kleinfeld, which says that these kind of social systems are more like sailing a boat in the wind and less like planning a railroad track in a linear way. And it just planted this little seed that change happens in these systems in a way that's non-linear and unexpected, but not completely unpredictable. And that got me kind of excited about complex systems and how they change. I wrote a book about that called States of Disorder, where I really looked at conflict settings. But that seed kind of stayed with me. So a few years ago, when I started working for the Secretary General's office on our Common Agenda report and the lead up to the Summit of the Future, I started thinking, could I take some of those ideas about complex systems and rather than just look at a conflict setting, look at the big questions, look at kind of climate change and environmental governance, the rise of AI, this kind of cyber world, financial systems, and broad kind of conflict systems as well, and see what would come out of that. So this book is really taking that seed of thinking about complex ecosystems and adaptation and then trying to adapt that to the big global governance challenges that we're trying to deal with today.
Super interesting. And I've read most of the book, and I found there a lot of refreshing material, ways of thinking about complex systems that are extremely timely right now, especially, as you know, this podcast is all about multilateralism. Multilateralism is definitely in transition, and this transition does not proceed in a linear way. Mm-hmm. So it really speaks volumes to me. So what I suggest we do is we go through an overview of the book, and if you could, maybe even chapter by chapter, because they're really, positioned in that kind of sequence that is really helpful in my view. But before we get there, let's go through a waypoint, a simple guide to complexity. Mm-hmm. That's the title I would put to this part of the podcast, right, if you will. So can you talk about complexity in a simple way?
I can try. And that's always the challenge, I think. I mean, one of the easiest ways to do it is with an example. And so think about an individual ant walking around on a sidewalk. Not a very smart creature. It'll go out and find food. It'll kind of do its thing. And you won't really know exactly what it's going to do. You can't predict it, but you have a sense of what it's capable of. If that ant suddenly becomes part of 200, 300, 400 ants, its behavior will start to interact with its neighboring ants. They'll exchange information. They'll pass information to each other about where the food is, where the risks are, and they'll start to develop a systemic relationship as a group. And what's interesting about that is, first of all, the outcomes of that group, how that group behaves and adapts to its environment, is more and different than what each of the individual ants can do on their own. The idea of collective intelligence kind of comes into play. So they can defend themselves from armies of wasps coming in. They can deal with floods. They build very sophisticated structures. And if you added up the intelligence of each ant and what they could do on their own, it's much less than that collective behavior. And that's an example of how a complex system is more and different than the sum of its parts. But when we think about life on a day-to-day basis, we often don't think in those terms. We think in linear terms, like more like a pool table, like you hit a billiard ball, you can predict the angle. Or you have a machine, the more energy you put into the machine, the more output you get. And you see this in global governance too. Look at Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart's famous book called Fixing Failed States. That's thinking of these big problems in mechanical input-output terms. It's the same problem I had in Eastern Congo, by the way, that you can fix these problems by fixing part of a system. And I think what's interesting about complex systems like ant colonies or galaxies or financial markets or fish, schools of fish or human societies is that you can't fix them by just addressing one part or piece of them. And so I think it's the starting point for complexity is this sense that you don't have a linear input-output. It's more about how the relationships between large numbers of actors feed back information and allow the system or the colony or the galaxy to change in response to external stimuli. And I think that's actually the quickest and easiest way to get started. It gets harder as you get along, but I think that's the starting point for complexity.
And pinpointing global governance, how does complexity applies to global governance, perhaps even contextualizing in the current situation?
Yeah, and so I think there are two fairly intuitive points to start with. The first one is that the problems that we have today are complex and interrelated. So if you think about how the environment is being affected by our behavior, it's not just climate change. It's not just our industry or our electricity. It's that we have our entire society is based on a way of using energy and building things that has a relationship with the environment. That affects biodiversity, that affects the temperature, that affects pollution. And these are all systems that overlap and interrelate. And that's intuitive. Anyone who studies environmental change understands that. I think the second part, though, is that our attempts to address and manage and govern those types of issues are also complex. You can think of the 12 or so treaty bodies that are meant to address environmental governance. You can think of all of the industries that are building our homes and driving our cars and our roads. You can think of our day-to-day. We just turned on the lights to come into this room. That's part of a set of overlapping social, environmental, and technical systems that we use to try to manage the environment. And they're interrelated. So if, for example, we change the subsidies on fossil fuels, that could have a cascading effect elsewhere in the system. When we banned chlorofluorocarbons to stop the ozone layer, that had a cascading effect across other systems too. So I think the two parts are the problem that we have, whether it's AI or war or the environment is complex. And part of that system is also our attempts to manage it. You can't just fix a machine at the top and solve a problem like this. You have to adapt alongside it.
And indeed, this is something you develop in chapter 2, because in chapter 2, you state what we all know. Our challenges are complex and interrelated. And then you go further by saying, but the governance structures that we're trying to mobilize to fix these are complex in themselves. They're complex systems in themselves. And that is very fascinating. There are other fascinating points you make before we get to the final part of the book that I found extremely provocative and exciting. So I want to get there at one point. But let's give the audience a sense. What's in there? What's in the book? So you already mentioned points that are in chapter 2, but you got 6 chapters there. So what are the main key points that you would like to offer to our audience? And also maybe as a teaser so they can go buy the book and read it. But we also like here to give the audience a sense of the entire work so they could at least quote it, in a clever way if they want.
Yeah, and I think what I try to do in this book is I take the basic idea of complexity, but then I take the big ideas that are on the table right now for addressing certain problems. So what are the big proposals for addressing climate change right now? And then I say, how could they be improved by adding that layer of complexity to them? So I'll give an example. And one of the strong tendencies that I point out throughout the book is this one where we try to fix things from the top. AI is a potentially dangerous thing. Let's get an AI treaty at the top and manage it down. The environment is a cross-cutting issue. Let's ban fossil fuels with the treaty. There's lots of this kind of sense of what some call the Leviathan approach, that kind of hegemonic attempt to control. And I keep trying to push back on that and say there may be more networked and adaptive ways of dealing with it. So that's kind of a theme that runs across it. But I'll give you an example from, maybe two examples from the book. One from environmental governance, which I think is chapter 3. And there, what you have is clearly human behavior and industry and our day-to-day work is affecting the environment in a wide variety of ways. And there are different calls for how to address that. One of them is a call to have a global environmental body that would kind of manage this interrelated change from the top. Another one would be, you have criminalization of damage to the environment that would be managed by like a global body. So lots of top-down types of thinking, but our linear thinking also persists. We've got these different treaty bodies. Each one of those deals with a specific thing: wetlands, desertification, climate change, pollution. Each of those has its own body of information within it and doesn't really talk to the other ones. And so you have essentially a siloed approach to a cross-cutting issue. And the solution that is being offered right now is these kind of global top-down thing. One of the options that is informed by complexity is you think, where are the centers of gravity actually in this system? Where are the tipping points in this system? And that's an important kind of concept. Those of you who have read Malcolm Gladwell will understand it. But where can you actually generate behavioral change underneath, affect the rules underneath the system? One of those could be that you shift the incentives so that people invest more in renewable energy and have less of an incentive to invest in brown energy or something else. Another could be that you change our understanding of what growth and progress looks like so that it's less about, economic progress per se, but also maybe about sustainable balance with the environment. And what that might look like as a governance structure is probably not a top-down treaty. It's probably creating much more kind of connective tissue between the existing sources of information so that they can feed back more quickly into our understanding of how change is happening. So, for example, could you have a live updated snapshot right now of where global greenhouse gases are being emitted that's fed back immediately into policy making? And one of the parallels here, an interesting one, is those who study ecosystems. Mushrooms that connect trees underneath the ground are able to do this kind of thing. They feed information in a live way about what's affecting the trees, whether that's drought, pollution, even attacks by animals, and they respond and distribute resources across the entire network of trees. You could imagine an environmental system that does the same thing, that's live, saying here's a new input into the system, and here's where we need to distribute resources in response to it. So much more distributed, but connecting the sources of information we have and creating a kind of live feedback loop. That's an example from environmental governance that I think changes maybe the way or the gloss that we'd have on the existing proposals out there today. I'm happy to give other examples, but I want to just pause there for a second.
Yes, and there is one that I would love to hear from you, is an example of the ideas you put out in chapter 4, where we could say we replace environmental governance with large-scale conflict resolution. So what happens then?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's often metaphors used in this book, and one of the ones I use when talking about war is thinking of it as a disease. Violence is a disease that can metastasize. And there's actually a great report from 2016 called States of Fragility that the OECD put out that shows how violence can move from domestic violence, violence against children, to gangs, into large-scale warfare. And there's kind of a fluidity and ability for it to spread. And I think if you look at how, conflicts from the Arab Spring spread across entire regions, it's intuitive there. And I think when you go back then to the big ideas that are currently on the table for addressing violent conflict, they are two or threefold. One is we need the Security Council to have more people in it. So fixing like a gap in the system. Another proposal that some put forward is you need a kind of global resilience council, something at the top that can deal with all the cross-cutting risks to human security. These are very top-down issues, but I don't think they're very likely to address what I think of as a systemic kind of landscape that's driving conflict. One of those, by the way, is military spending and our tendency to, if you think about it as a landscape where there are kind of troughs and mountains in it, and if you pour water into that landscape, they'll tend to gather around the troughs or the low points. So what kind of militarization approach here would say is every time we put energy or let's say we put peace-building resources into something or a mediation response into something, the center of gravity, the attractor in the system tends to be the military. So we did a study, for example, looking at how the UN's peace-building responses tended to be captured by a small military elite in countries. I think you can see that at the global level, where our responses to, let's say, the Ukraine, the Russia's war of aggression in the Ukraine, that resulted in a spike in military spendings and a reduction of spending in social services, exactly the kind of thing that will drive inequality, create greater risks in the long term. So what I'm thinking of in the violent conflict area is how can you actually re-landscape? How can you create structures that will actually deflect resources and energy away from militarization and towards more kind of social equality responses? And that sounds a little wishy-washy, but you can actually show how that could happen. For example, if you put conditioning on spending that the World Bank and the IMF did, if some of that was peace positive outcomes, you'd create a feedback loop. Every time the World Bank puts $1 into something, there needs to be a mechanism that feeds back to the World Bank. Is this having a peaceful outcome or not? And if it's not, that should dry up and you should redirect resources elsewhere. Same thing for national budgets. You could imagine a report that says, your national budgets need to have a peace positive outcome. Interpeace, by the way, here in Geneva is doing really interesting work on this financing for peace. But I think what I try and do in the peace and security area is think if violence is something that can spread and result in macro effects like militarization or escalation, rather than trying to put a Band-Aid on that to stop the symptom, go under the surface and think more like you're trying to build an immune system that responds in a way that actually matches the problem underneath the surface.
And in chapter 5, you treat cyber attacks as the most pernicious form of infection. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the cyber world is one of the ones that is most intuitively a complex system. When you even map it out, you can think of us all kind of connected to each other through our phones and our computers. And when you talk to cybersecurity experts, and some of those here in Geneva too, they often talk about infections. You get a virus that spreads through the system. That's a metaphor. It isn't actually a virus. Or you talk about how your walls are breached and you need to build up your defense systems. That's the US approach to cyber attacks. And also knowing that someone's going to get through your defenses in cybersecurity. The US and Europe's response is to build great offensive response capacities to deter attacks. So a lot of our response to cyber attacks actually has to do with the metaphors we use to describe it. It's a castle we need to defend. It's a body we need to stop getting infected. It's a terrain that we don't want to turn into a battlefield. And what's interesting about that is that actually drives what kind of response you do. The US, I think, spends something like 40 times more on offensive cyber response capabilities than to defensive. That means they've decided that something's going to get through the perimeter, so they need to deter attacks. And I think one of the ways of mapping out what would need to be a viable response to cybersecurity is you think of what are all the entities that would need to be involved to develop a kind of systemic response. It would be the national security entities. It would be the tech ones, but it would also be trade. It would also be individual businesses. One of the interesting examples that I draw out in the book is in 2007, Estonia suffered a major cyber attack from Russia. And rather than build up a big wall outside around the perimeter of them, what they actually did was they trained all of the actors within their country, businesses and tech leaders and government officials, on how to develop their own node capacity response to this so that it strengthened them. So Estonia now has a remarkable kind of immune system to cyber attacks. And it doesn't mean they won't be attacked. They get attacked every day. But what happens is when they get attacked, there's kind of a clustering of actors that are able to respond more like an immune system. The opposite is true in the US. The US gets attacked, and what happens is they launch a really serious response to that. It's not a distributed immune system. It's a heavy-hitting kind of outward-facing attack. And I think using those kind of metaphors actually can help us map and understand what a more kind of distributed response to these kind of risks might look like.
And of course, while we are at it and we talk about cyber attacks, chapter 6 deals with the rise of artificial intelligence. And you're able to look at it from different angles. Do you want to talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, and this is kind of AI is the hot topic right now. And one of the interesting things about I was writing this book really at the same time as the high-level advisory body on AI was coming out with its report. And as I was working also previously on the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, we looked at AI also. It's interesting how quickly our ideas about responding to AI have evolved. But I think one of the interesting kind of characteristics of AI is the large language models and the algorithms that are developed to do that actually are complex systems, and they create a kind of opaque interior that we don't know what's happening. So it's actually very hard to know sometimes where a risk from AI is going to emerge because it's coming from a system that we can't see inside of. Now that's a simplification, but I think also AI is acting as a kind of accelerant on other risks. So if you look at, biological research, suddenly it converges with AI, and synthetic biology could create enormous new risks. AI can converge with nuclear weapons and create enormous kind of self-propagating risks. And so AI just doesn't sit in one place. It's almost like it's an accelerant across our social and technical systems. And so that made it kind of ripe for thinking of what a good response would be. And I think, again, the tendency, and you heard the Secretary General actually mention this over a year ago now. He came out with a public statement that said we need an IAEA, like a nuclear energy agency, to deal with the risks of AI. Very top down, very kind of, we're going to manage this thing with an agency from the top. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but it suddenly made me think, oh, this is very typical of our response. And then another idea that was put forward was we need an IPCC structure for AI. So a place where all the different information, like around climate change, can come together and be scientifically vetted. Skeptics of that would say, yeah, but the IPCC hasn't stopped, our destruction of the climate for the last 30 years. Why would we build something so weak to deal with the AI? And I think what I point towards is actually there's a really good proposal by Wendell Wallach and Anya Kasperson that talks about a kind of observatory that would feed back information about AI risks as they emerge. And so you could imagine, and this is one of the concepts from complexity, is a negative feedback loop is when you start reaching a certain threshold, like if you're filling up the bathtub and you reach the top, there's usually a little hole at the top of the bathtub that lets the water out, and so it goes back down again. That's a very simple idea of a negative feedback loop. When we get hot, we sweat, it cools us down. That's a negative feedback loop. Could you think of a negative feedback loop around AI where when it reaches a certain threshold of risk or capacity, could you then have it go back down again or could you have a way of curbing or controlling or reducing those risks? So one way to do that, very technical way you could do that, is you go to the chip manufacturers and you could actually put something on the chip where when it reaches a certain threshold of capacity or when it starts doing something that it shouldn't be doing, it can verify that on the chip and maybe feed back to a system. So having an observatory that could help with that negative feedback loop around AI risks could complement some of the legislation and approaches to AI you see in the EU, the one that, Gavin Newsom just vetoed one in California that would have been quite interesting. But I think thinking more less in terms of controlling and managing from the top and more in terms of adapting with those risks as they come and managing them as they come is an interesting concept that I think could help the AI discussion a bit.
And that basically is the overview. We touched on all chapters, I think, that deals with these big topics. And they're all there. They're all part of the complex system of challenges that we're in the middle of right now in the world. But then there is this almost unexpected conclusion, which is quite amazing. As you read the book, then you come to this point where you come up with this radical idea that we could build a planetary, I'm quoting, planetary immune system. Now, can you tell us more about this idea? What's a planetary immune system?
Sure, and I should start by adding a kind of acknowledgement there that term actually came from a guy in Switzerland, Dirk Helbing, who's at one of the major universities here. So, maybe just taking one step back, and then I'll come to the planetary immune system. Even the name, the forever crisis, captures this idea that if we're constantly responding to the latest, most immediate threat, we're always going to be in crisis response mode. The cover of the book is this school of fish that's being attacked. This is when schools of fish are attacked by a shark or by a predator, they form a certain structure. It's built in. And I feel like we're in this moment of constantly responding to the next crisis and not being able to look over the horizon at the bigger one. It's even the title of the book is a reference to a science fiction book called The Forever War, which is about how we continually respond to attacks from the outside. It's a great book. And so in the final chapter, what I suggest is as we develop these large data capacities through AI, through the generation, the WMO produces a huge amount of modeling and data around how we're affecting the environment. There is an increasing capability to aggregate and bring together that data in a way that might allow us to think about how our global system evolves in real time. And Dirk Helbing has done some work on this around the financial collapse in 2008, where he essentially showed that you could maybe even predict something like the financial collapse of 2008 if you can do a large enough model. And so one of the ideas I started talking about was, could you create a kind of large data approach And it wouldn't be perfect, but that would start modeling how change is happening at the planetary level and start feeding back information more regularly and directly. And that could start with environmental change. I mentioned this idea of looking at greenhouse gas emissions, but you could imagine one that included all of the topics we've talked about today. Where is social unrest rising up? Where are kind of AI risks and maybe cyber risks reaching certain thresholds? We're now reaching a point where I think that could begin to become a kind of something we can model globally and start thinking about what the response might need to look like in real time. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. But I do think also that what systems thinking allows you to do is get out of this kind of siloed approach where, you see something happen and you think about what's the immediate solution to that problem. The place where you might need to make change might be somewhere very far from the system or within the system. It may not be an immediate kind of Band-Aid. And that's kind of what the last chapter points towards too, is our social and economic and political systems are actually adapting over long periods of time. And changes we make now could have massive effects in 50 years. And unless we start thinking about those massive effects, we may be making changes now or baking in certain ways of doing things that could have existential risk. The fact that we're able to have this many nuclear weapons on the planet is crazy to me. But also the financial system we baked in now is very likely to strip billions of people of basic livelihoods in 20 years. It's already starting to do it for many. And so I think the systems thinking also allows you to project forward and deal with what kind of Tom Hale talks about as long problems in a way that's a bit more dynamic and less linear. And that coming back to that same idea, what we put in today is not going to have an output that you can predict in a linear way tomorrow. It might have a cascading positive or negative one. And I think the overall goal of this book will be to start equipping policymakers and academics with the idea of kind of systemic change that you can start thinking about now to deal with problems now that will also maybe have a transformational effect in 15, 20 years.
Great. And thank you for clarifying where the title comes from. I think the book itself says it in the introductory part. So where can the audience find the book? Is open access as well? Is it the usual vendors? Just shameless publicity here.
Shameless publicity, absolutely. It's published by Routledge, so the biggest academic publisher. I insisted with Routledge that they issue a simultaneous paperback because these academic things tend to be expensive. So you can get it on Amazon, UK, US, Europe, Germany, wherever. You can get it directly from Routledge. You can come to my office and I'll sell you a cheaper version in my office in Geneva. But it unfortunately isn't open access. You can get digital versions directly for a cheaper price. I think the challenge of academic books is they sit in this exclusive kind of space. And one of the things I'd hope to do for the next book would be to have a purely open access one. Unfortunately, this one is not, but I'm happy to sell at cost if people want to come back.
And where can we find more about your work, your publications, your research, also in the framework of the UN University?
Yeah, so UN University Center for Policy Research has a website where all of this is linked. We have an office in New York, and our doors are always open. We're a permeable layer. I have an office in the Maison de la Paix. But I think the work that I'm doing really builds on a lot of thinking that's already out there. And so one of the things I'd encourage listeners to do is also find the issue they're interested in. And I have a bibliography that allow you to go way down rabbit holes on complex systems thinking. One of the things I've found about people like this is we're a weird bunch, but not many people call us up. And I cold called a lot of people for this kind of work, including at, the Santa Fe Institute that has a whole complexity. Very high level academics, all of them responded to my calls in a positive way. They're actually all in the acknowledgments. And so I think if you're interested in this kind of work, first of all, there aren't a lot of us. It's a place where you can expand very quickly. And so I'd encourage researchers also to think about how some of these ideas could permeate their own PhDs or books or hopefully policy decisions in the future.
Excellent. And that sounds like a final message, but do you have another final message for our audience to leave with them? A little bit like a pearl of wisdom that occurred to you while writing this book or after writing it. What is a key message you want to leave with all of us?
Well, I think what happened to me in working on this book, and people who know me know that I can be very cynical about ability of kind of the multilateral system to address these problems. And we spend a lot of time, especially in the UN system, complaining and harping on about how bad things are and how bureaucratic they are. And I think the thought I'd like to leave folks with is if you feel kind of desperate and cynical and like you can't generate change, I do think that complexity offers a more dynamic and exciting and maybe even optimistic approach that won't necessarily erase your skepticism, but will give you a sense that even small, tiny little ants in the big system can generate global change. And I think we need a lot more of that kind of feeling if we're gonna take on the big challenges.
Adam, thank you so much for being with us this is, I think, the third episode we record together, always so interesting, and for enriching our collection of episodes with this view from the forever crisis, which could become actually a way to stop having forever crisis in future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Francesco. It's great to be here.